Okay, Tim. You said that you would be interested in watching some of my chess videos, but I told you that the chess videos I had might not be particularly useful for you, so I decided I might make you a few that are just for you. So this is a Lichess study that you can look at. My Lichess name is Micah Joel 2E. You can tell that by if you look at the upper hand corner here. I don't know if the screensaver records my cursor or not. But anyway, I'd like to start out just by helping you understand the opening of the game. The book I sent you was an endgame book, but for this, I just want to show you kind of the point of the beginning of a chess game. And to start out, I think it's always good to think about just the idea of what are the first moves of chess usually, and why are they made. So we're looking at White's perspective, and what I have with these little colorful arrows here is I have the first moves of chess, at least the most ones that are the most common among people who know what they're doing. We're going to go from left to right here. There is c4, and c4 pressures the center, pressures this d5 square. There is d4, which we see pressures the c5 and the e5 square. We see e4, which is probably the move you should start with. It's famous for not only pressuring this d5 and f5 square, but also what it does is it gets out the queen and the bishop for a fast attack, if that's the way you want to go. And then finally, the other common move is knight f3, which also pressures the center of the board. It pressures the d4 and the e5 square. And hopefully what you've noticed about what all these moves have in common is that they are all fighting for the center of the board. They're all trying to fight not only to get pieces out, but to try to control the center of the board in order to be able to get to the high ground, basically, of the board. So when we talk about the center of the board, right, what we're really talking about is these four central squares, d4, e4, d5, and e5. And from these squares, this is, if you can control these squares, you can usually control the whole board. So if we were using kind of military jargon, this would be kind of like the high ground or the elevated position. So let's look through some of these openings and just to kind of see what the point of them all is, and to understand kind of how we have strategy from the very beginning of a chess game. So if we start with e4, this is the most common move on both the amateur and the master level. The other super common move, which is very strong and equally popular among masters, is d4. But e4 is more common for lower level players. And the key idea of all the things that e4 does, we see it pressures the f5 square, we see it pressures the d5 square, gets the bishop out, gets the queen out. But the most important thing it does, of all the things it does, not only does it enhance development of these pieces, but the actual most important thing it does is it goes after this d5 square, which is a really critical square for controlling the board and for launching an attack. And I know that might not seem like a big deal early on, but it actually ends up being very, very, very critical. But let's just look at some of the usual responses. If you're worried about the d5 square, one of the responses to e4 is the Scandinavian defense, which is d5. And the Scandinavian defense, right, which is the center counter defense, it basically just, it attacks the pawn and invites to be attacked right away in return. And the usual main line is e takes d5, and then queen takes d5, and then knight c3, and then the queen usually comes to the side. I don't recommend this opening because I think that it's actually too slow. I also think that, and what I mean by too slow is, what you give with this move is when you give this knight c3 move, you give a developmental move, but this move also attacks the queen, forcing the piece to move twice in the opening. And this, to me, gives helps give a time advantage to white. But what it's trying to do in this more open game, it's a wide open tactical game with a lot of piece development. What's usually going to happen is there are a lot of pieces that are going to come out, and the board is going to be very, very wide open, right? But that's just one way in which white responds to e5. The two most important responses to e5 are or e4 are e5 and c5. And what you'll notice is both of these moves actually pressure the same key square. e5 pressures the d4 square, and you'll notice that c5 does the exact same thing. But the difference is this one, which is symmetrical, it has a lot of the same goals. It's preventing, first of all, it's preventing the white pawn from being able to move up, right? There's no way that, that it can move up because it's blockaded by the pawn. And just like this move gets out the pieces, right, for white, you'll notice that black's pieces, right, the queen and the bishop, are similarly able to get out and try to wreak immediate havoc. This isn't necessarily the best strategy, but it is an opportunity. It's a possibility. So the main thing, is this is a very balanced response to e5, e4, and it leads to a lot of the different mainline theory. And we're actually going to look at this a little bit deeper in a minute. The other main response to e4 is c5. This is called the Sicilian defense. This is right now probably the most important response to e4, and it generally, again, it's the reason why it's asymmetrical, it's unbalanced, is black is going to try to be aggressive right away by not doing what white's doing, but trying to do something entirely different. But the idea still is it's still considering like the trying to control these central squares. One really popular Sicilian, right, is the Sicilian dragon, which I'll just show you real quick. And the Sicilian dragon, right, which has a lot of different ways in which it can be played. But a key idea to this opening, as you can see, is you're noticing that there's a ton of interconnected piece play here. You'll notice that in the Sicilian, right, this fianchettoed bishop, that's the term, fianchetto, is doing what? It's attacking these central dark squares, and that's also what the pawn is doing, and that's also what the knight is doing, right? There's this idea of fighting for certain territory on the board. And in return, you see that white is putting an awful lot of pressure on the d5 square, right, on the central light squares. And this switches, right? It's not so simple as central dark squares and central light squares, but this is how a game in chess usually begins. Now that's not a very good opening line, by the way, that I showed you. There are other ways you should go about it. But I'm just kind of showing you the general way of going about it. Another important thing about, looking at possible responses to e4 are these other asymmetrical defenses that still aim to go to d5. Like we showed in the Scandinavian defense, how he went d5 right away. But this move is better when it's prepared by something else. So one of the interesting things about opening theory is asking, what are you trying to do? So let's say just for a moment that black makes a garbage move. This is h6. This is an absolute garbage move. The best move that white can now make, very, very clearly, is d4. Right? Like this is clearly the move that white should make. And why should white make this move? Because now, if you look at where the pawns are attacking, right? So the d4 pawn is attacking c5 and e5. The e4 pawn is attacking d5 and f5. What it creates is this area where black cannot develop his pieces right away. This is called a strong pawn center, or this is what's called a pawn center. And by having this pawn center, white can exert an enormous amount of pressure on the board, right? And so this is why this move, this h6 move, is so bad, because it doesn't do anything to fight for the center or develop any pieces, right? So one of the things that often happens is after e4, black will play an asymmetrical defense, but it won't be the kind of thing that it doesn't play d5 right away. Right? Instead of playing d5 right away, it'll prepare d5 one of two ways. It'll, in the French, right, which is e6, it's looking to play d5 on the next move. So usually what happens is then d4, and then, right, which has this strong center, and then black means to immediately interrupt it. It's the same thing with the Caro-Kann, right? that is 1e4 c6. And the whole point of the c6, once again, is to play this d5 right away. And in playing this d5, looking to play this d5 right away, right, we see it's the exact same idea, to immediately challenge this strong pawn center that white is trying to build. Right? And there's a lot of theory to all of this, but the main idea is just we see from the very beginning that he is trying to contest the central squares. So video has gone for about 10 minutes now, and YouTube only allows 15-minute uploads. So I'm going to pause here, and then we're going to pick up from there in part 2 of this particular video.